I'm John Thomas Richards, professor of English. I teach at Columbia College, Fort Leonard Wood, and I am here to tell you a little about the SORRAT experiments and the Cox-Calvin RSPK automatic filming device experiments, which are a part of SORRAT. Now, in 1959, I met John G. Neihart, Poet Laureate of Plain States of the United States and Poet Laureate of Nebraska. Dr. Neihart introduced me to the SORRAT concept, Society for Research on Rapport and Telekinesis. I'm going to skip a great many of the details, but SORRAT was formed in September 1961 at Skyrim Farm near Columbia, Missouri. This was Dr. Neihart's home. He made me one of the original members of this group, and my job was largely to record any phenomena which might take place. Now, Dr. Neihart's idea in forming SORRAT was to see if he could replicate the phenomena, the physical paranormal phenomena which took place during many 19th century experiments, and apparently was no longer taking place, chiefly because no one seemed to be running experiments to find out about these things. Now, things were being done which he did not know about, but we thought at the time that SORRAT was the only group of its sort. Now, in the fall of 1961, we began getting some minor physical phenomena, raps and slight vibrations of tables. By the spring of 1962, there were gross movements of physical objects. We would sit around a table in the usual sort of seance circle, and we would attempt to simply accept whatever happened. We weren't striving to get something to happen. Wasn't a mental effort involved at all, or just seeing what would happen, and many things did happen. Now, I'm going to skip over the intervening years because gradually things got increasingly strong with the physical phenomena. In the mid-1960s, Dr. Neihart contacted his old friend from the 1930s, Dr. Joseph Banks Rhine, the Foundation for Research on the Nature of Man in Durham, North Carolina. Rhine made suggestions for making observation boxes and other things that would provide an atmosphere for contained PK movements, psychokinetic movements of target objects. Next step involved William Edward Cox. Now, Dr. Rhine sent Mr. Cox out to Missouri to work with the SORRAT group. He eventually, with the help of his assistant, Steve Calvin, built what he referred to as the Cox-Calvin RSPK, Recurrent Spontaneous Psychokinesis, filming device, and hooked it through micro switches to a mini lab box, a transparent container with micro switches inside a container which could be securely locked and sealed and still allow some of this unusual psychokinetic activity to take place in a controlled environment. Now, Cox had discovered, as we all had, at Skyrim during the experiments there, that the experiments themselves did not require people sitting around in a circle trying to get something to happen. We had assumed earlier that our minds would be what was controlling it, but apparently this wasn't true. It happened whether anyone was present or not. Well, this meant that either you sat around 24 hours a day observing, or you figured out some way to record what did happen when it took place. With Cox's mini lab, we were able to place target objects, designated target objects, on micro switches, and then at any time of the day or night when any PK did take place, the camera would automatically start when the micro switch was tripped, a timer would run, the camera would run for a certain amount of time, and it would capture this on film with lights and camera going on automatically. Therefore, the people involved could go about other things. We'd still run the regular sessions, the experiments, but and they do many other experimental tests, which I won't go into, but the mini lab itself would capture automatically what took place.
My name is William Edward Cox, and I have appointed myself to be an investigator of the phenomena that have been going on for years in Rolla and in Skyrim near Columbia, Missouri. I've been very interested in psychical research, for well over 50 years. Got into it through magic as a magician, and that has put me in good stead in many ways because I can use the skills that are developed there to accommodate myself in investigating all manners of the paranormal: clairvoyance, precognition, mind over matter, psychokinesis as it is now called. It used to be called telekinesis, and it is that which has drawn me to the state of Missouri, where I now live. And I've been researching with Dr. Tom Richards for 10 years now. But my interests stem from being not only a magician, but having such an interest in psychical research that when I moved to North Carolina in '32, I learned of Dr. Ryan, who had just started his laboratory a few years earlier at Duke University, and I began to associate with him. And after World War II, in which I served only briefly, I began contributing to his journal, and then devoting more and more of my time to his work in statistical evidence for ESP, and particularly psychokinesis, in which I was immensely interested. And that's what I have been doing on a scholarly view with statistical scientific evidence that is pretty dull in the lab for years. But then I'm augmenting it now with the most unusual opportunity ever that I've heard of in this field, namely close-up investigation with camera of physical phenomena that are inexplicable.
What made you, and you're a graduate engineer, experienced magician, world-famous parapsychologist, what made you to the creative inspiration of the mini-lab? A way of trapping this, filming it, having a record that everyone could peruse and make their minds up.
This was the idea of Dr. J.B. Ryan, the head of the Parapsychology Laboratory, Foundation for Research on the Nature of Man, and for half a century head of that famous lab at Duke University. And there was one of these little glass boxes that had been made by one of our members, donors, that were right there in Durham, North Carolina. And the idea originally was hers, but Dr. Ryan suggested to me, make a mini lab, just make a box, well-secured glass box, so that you can lock it up and make it portable, and you will really have a little laboratory. And it made sense, so I promptly made one. And on my next visit out to Missouri, I took it along. It was about a cubic foot, and of all plexiglass except the bottom, which was a glass mirror. It had a shelf in it and a few other trinkets in there, and a couple of little locks on top that were cheap. But I retained the keys to those locks at all times, and yet things did happen in that box. A few things, not too many. although the box was loose and you could have faked a little bit, you could have stuck a piece of paper with something written on it through the crack in the top, because the box was not as skillfully made as my later ones. But that's our first mini lab. And it sits up at Skyrim right now. It's been up there for years, waiting for something to happen. But nothing has. And the next mini lab was a aquarium tank, which I made after moving here in Rolla. Just putting it on wood, binding it with steel, a 1-inch wide steel strap that went around it, and the holes in the end of it were locked with a adequate padlock, tight, so tight you couldn't possibly get the bottom wood off. Now the bottom wood is bottom because the aquarium tank is upside down upon it, and it is bound by having the steel strap go through a couple of holes, slots in the wooden base. And everything I put in there are viable targets, whatever I think of putting in there, anything. And my 3 switches of electrical contacts were put in there at the same time so that it could start the camera. We were experienced with a camera because before I made my second mini lab with switches, the thing I brought from Durham didn't have switches in it. It was just a glass box, plexiglass. But when I put this second one in place, got phenomena, we had already tested a camera that Steve Calvin, a graduate student of chemical engineering at the University of Missouri here in Rolla, who was my formal full-time assistant whenever I needed him. I employed his services to start with. And he was very helpful, and one of the things, not only did he furnish the camera and an electrical relay system for triggering the camera whenever a switch inside of this new mini lab was thrown, but he did various other things, including the lens arrangement and the accurate sharpness of it and the lights. Anyhow, we had the trick to where the little switches in the mini lab would start the camera whenever anything disrupted. And that's how we began to get our formal tests after we had done some original ones of laying a pencil on top of a little cradle, hoping that the pencil, when it lifted off the cradle, would break the electrical connection and we would see it flying. We did. We didn't see it right, but we saw it rolling about in its sheep fashion until one day when it rose up gradually, went out of sight into the air beyond the view of the camera. And it was then that I decided to make a new mini lab to replace my old one with switches. And that's when we began to get good, viable, proofable inside information. The camera. We have some phenomena that puzzle me, that will amuse the critics, like this one. That's when I just now said my pencil rose, jumped, got out of view of the camera from its little cradle without any mini lab around it in the early days. What do you reckon I later found when I later on, much later on, re-examined that sequence of film? Only 3 or 4 frames of film viewed the pen after it had left the cradle and was standing on its vertical leg. It didn't write anything, it just stood there for an instant and then went on up. There was a white thread stretched from it right down to the bottom of the exposed area of the film frame. And it's clearly there on all 3 successive images. Now what does that mean? I don't know. It happened once again later on. But if that implies fraud, which to my mind it does not, you would have to explain a ton of other stuff by similar method, including plenty of other writing of pens in which there was no string attached.
And such an assortment of phenomena. You mentioned the direct writing. You briefly touched on the rings. What are the things, a brief catalog of the type of phenomena you've seen, recorded.
It is too wide for me to
You
announce.
had sorting of beans, different colored beans, coins, on command.
Oh, yes.
Were you told, Tom, or a written message to that effect inside the mini lab or in the isolation room?
Yes. Inside the mini lab, I have laid them, and the beans would be assorted, or the little rice grains, some of which were colored black, would be assorted into the other little tray. They couldn't be seen by the camera, though, they're too small.
Sorting of cards, spontaneous combustion.
Oh, sure. Exactly 30 totally different types
30 different
of phenomena
What is the common
that I have had experience. Now, many more than that have occurred to Skyrim, but the Skyrim phenomena occur without any scientific safeguards against fraud and accuracy.
Do you see any correlations with place in the building, time of day, presence of people, absence of people, jazzed up feelings, whatever?
No, not particularly.
Random times, nighttime, daytime?
Not particularly, not as much as I should hope.
Nothing outstanding, no sore thumb sticking out. Aha,
No, none yet.
yeah.
I haven't had any opportunity to put electroencephalographic tests on Tom, nor do I have the time and equipment to do it with. That can be done by someone else who replicates these phenomena. Another thing, various other things should be done. He could be given various tests. He isn't particularly interested in it, isn't desirous of having those tests anyway.
What is that anyway, that fancy Rube Goldberg Ed Cox device?
Well, this is a smaller model that was made. Originally, this was the first model, but then I made a larger model with more than 2 electrical switches within. This one has only a couple of switches, and outside shorting switches are here for necessary reasons. But this larger model of a bigger aquarium tank served better. And then one day, Yorkshire Television of England, who had learned about us, insisted on filming this for the Arthur C. Clarke series, The World of, what was the title of that book now? Anyway, Arthur C. Clarke's World of Strange Powers. And that series of 13 weeks long featured one of them on psychokinesis, and this box was featured in it. The locksmith hired by me earlier on for my own benefit to do an excellent job of tying up the big original mini lab, and I told him that I was a magician, which happened to be true, and gave him that excuse for my wanting him to lock it up well. And I said I would pay him for his time, and he had better not fail to do a good job, and please don't put any writing pen or pencil inside it. Well, he did as I asked, and he laid a sheet of blank paper in there, and in 3 days I came back to his locksmith's shop with writing on that paper and a pen within, and he about fell through the ground. We looked at it outside of his shop on a little card table. He looked at the lock and swore that his lock was perfect. Then I took my blanket off of the mini lab and showed him what was in it, and he didn't know what to think. He thought it was all electrical. Well, of course he did. Now this box is a smaller one that he successfully did an excellent job of locking up for Yorkshire Television. These coins down here were laid by me inside on 8 little receptacles within, with the hopes that they would vanish and go into on the table. Well, actually only 1 was found on the table. The remaining 7 were shipped off by mail to 7 different members of the community, 7 people I know, some of whom were SORRAT members, like Apoff and McLennan and others. These coins thus, one of them went to Arthur C. Clarke. In fact, it went into Arthur C. Clarke's home through a letter that was placed in here by Yorkshire. The Yorkshire Authority, Mr. Adam Hart Davis, who was the director of the filming crew, put a letter which was typewritten on the spot by his stenographer and secretary, typewriter and all, in my backyard where they filmed the whole business. And it was addressed with an ordinary amount of stamps, but it vanished from here. As you see, it is no longer here. You also can see that these 2 locks are absolutely, genuinely secure. They have jammed key on the interior, and a tissue paper glued on top of that with super glue by the paid locksmith, and he has signed it with his name. Both of them are still there, and there's not a way in the world normally that you can open this and get in, but paranormally it was no problem. The letter did vanish, and it went through the mails to Mr. Arthur C. Clarke in Sri Lanka. It was received by him with a couple of foreign stamps slapped on it, from what source we do not know. I know that it wasn't any hanky-panky because the hanky-pankiest would first have to open this pair of locks that I've just shown you and get in there and remove the letter. And there's the enigma.
This is the tank, which is fit on top of a solid base. The base has grooves into which the tank fits. The base cannot be slid sideways. The band goes around the mini lab under the base. The only break in the band is at this point. The lock, which you'll notice is a combination lock, is preset by the experimenter only. No one else in the group would know the combination. In addition, Cox also used special string through the hole so that in the band, so that the string could be melted, and then a notary public seal placed over the string to provide extra sealing. Inside the mini lab there are micro switches on which target objects are set. A timer would set off lights and a camera. Once an event had occurred, a switch could be turned off, still leaving other micro switches ready to be triggered by other events. There are, as you see, 6 switches. These are connected to the micro switches inside, enabling all or only a few to be used at one time. I'd like to show some of the films that were made by the mini lab beginning in 1979 and ending in 1981. Switch is being tested now. A tank has been placed over a pencil. The machine was triggered by the pencil moving off of the micro switch. Now you can see the pencil on the micro switch, then off of the micro switch as it is now, and you can see it move slightly under the tank that's simply placed over the board. It is not strapped down at this point. You can see a slight movement of the pencil, but no writing at this time. The bell in the corner is not being rung either. There's another slight movement from the pencil. Now, in this version you can see that the pendula are swinging disparately. Here the band has been placed around the mini lab and it has been locked, and the clock shows real-time passage. Now you can see Ed Cox putting a string around the lock at the top of the mini lab and melting the string. He will then put his notary seal on top of this. Now, you notice in this one that a pin has erected itself inside the box and is marking. His first messages were very crude, but it's going on slightly in the coffee. Very slightly, and there is a vibratory activity. The box appears to be shaking rather than any particular thing happening inside the box. Now you can see Ed Cox fastening the box together at the beginning of this sequence. Shows what has happened inside the box. 4 leather rings. Now watch those rings very carefully. The small marker clock is going around one revolution every second, show real time. The name John King, or J. King, has been written by the pen, and you'll notice that the cube has made a serpentine motion through the coffee grounds. Now the cube has jumped on top of a film canister. The canister contains a small amount of unexposed film, which, when it was developed, was shown to have radiation effects. You can see it move across the front of the mini-lab. The cube moving from the micro switch in the rear is what triggered off this sequence. You see the cube lying at the left. Now watch those rings. They will link together and rise to the top and then unlink. Watch the rings carefully. Notice that they have linked. They're now at the top of the box. They've moved to the rear. You'll see them move to the front again. They're out of camera range behind the lock. Now you'll see them come down again and unlink very smoothly. The rings were not broken in any way. This is the end of that sequence. You can see what has happened. The fogging, of course, is due to light leakage on the film, the end of the film. Now, the next sequence, you simply see that some things are simply sitting there, not much is occurring at this point. Notice that the pen has fallen. It is written very rapidly on the paper. Rethink time. Watch what has occurred with the timer. The hand has reversed itself, started out going counterclockwise and abruptly started going clockwise. The message rethink time was significant for that, we believe. You notice also that there's been some disturbance in the coffee grounds and the coffee tray. Pendula are swinging. In this experiment, you see the rings set up, and they're lying in front of the mini-lab at this point. In this experiment, a box has been set in front of the mini-lab to double the chances of something being captured. The mini-lab is in the background. The sealed plastic box with a planchette is shown inside. A ring has moved out of the backward mini-lab. You can see it lying between the two. So we have in effect two mini-labs, one in front of the other here. The planchette holds the pen upright so that markings can be observed, as you notice on the white paper on the base. The box was sealed. Later you'll get to see the pen and planchette move about independently. You can see a matchbook moving inside the box. Moves back and forth almost like an insect. Here the entire box moves. This is one of the less satisfactory experiments because you can see what's happening is happening in front of the box. Now here the box is much too close to the camera. You can see the end of the pen moving, but you can't see all of what's taking place. The camera just does not cover enough territory. But the plastic box is in front of the mini lab. They're both securely sealed. Planchette would often write rather elaborate messages. As an instance, near St. Patrick's Day it wrote, "St. Paddy was an engineer," and drew a shamrock. Here you can see the interior of the mini lab. Now you can see more of the planchette movement. The rings have fallen off of their micro switch and hooked onto the planchette. Notice it drawing. You can see a top view. Cox is panning to show what has happened up to this point in the mini lab, and in the plastic box in front of the mini lab. Notice a ring has fallen into the coffee tray, a small flag has fallen over. Cox is pointing out the various things that have happened in this. This sequence, notice the machine is started because the planchette moved slightly away from the micro switch and then stopped. That was a frequent problem. Again, Cox has pointed out the word "think" that has been written on the paper in the back of the mini lab. Nice, pointing out what has occurred, showing how the box has been additionally sealed. Now you can see a small matchbook moving about in the bottom of the box in front of the mini lab. A small toy car is moving about in that box. It's very difficult to observe because it's moving quite close to the bottom of this frame. You can see a slight movement. Now you can see something's all right. You can see that the box shows some motion inside. Now a balloon has inflated inside the mini lab. You see a funny face balloon is moving slightly, although the box is completely sealed. We place the balloon entirely deflated with a string tied around the neck very often on a micro switch, and when it inflated it would trigger the camera. Notice the balloon is moving inside the sealed box. In fact, it's even bouncing a little up toward the top of the box. Now you can see a pen movement. Planchette has moved the pen away from the micro switch. Sometimes weeks or months would pass between activities. And unfortunately this time the pen had gone dry, so we're not exactly sure what it was writing. Here comes the pen again, although of course we didn't know that it was dry. And this sequence took place shortly after the preceding one. between sequences, either I or some other person, Steve Calvin, Ed Cox, or someone else in the group would reset the switches and rewind the camera, and Cox alone could open the containers. The rest of us simply reset to another micro switch and rewound the camera and got it ready to go again. Here you can see some more of the pen movement. Move slightly off of the micro switch. Notice the panning to show what has occurred. Cox is concentrating on the movement of a small target object. Now you can see in this sequence the pen moving away from the micro switch and drawing on the bottom of the box. This was taking place during the summer of 1980, during the first series of experiments. A toy car moving back and forth inside the mini lab. It apported into the box. It's a model of a 1950 Mercury Club coupe. Here's a model which also apported into the box of a Model A. It's moving back and forth almost like it's trying to get out of a tight parking spot, and doubtless that's what set off the camera, was striking the planchette and knocking it off the micro switch. That's why you don't get an actual view of the thing materializing inside the box this time. This happened from outside the box. You can see it back up and strike the micro switch and then proceed forward. Panning shows what had happened. Now we get a view of pen writing in the bottom of the plastic box, swinging about. See the letters being formed. Panning shows what has happened. Now, you can watch the small matchbook go rapidly back and forth, and then it will eventually jump into the air at the beginning of the next sequence. It's seeming to build momentum here. See the pressure it's exerting against the paper on the bottom of the box. Move toward the front of the box. Now it's moving back in camera range. Now, in slow motion, you can see it jump, then come down again. doesn't seem to be intelligent activity. It's simply moving in a random fashion back and forth on the paper. Right here you see car moving back and forth again in the box. Well, Model A is moving back and forth. Panning shows the layout, and you can see the planchette. The flag has stuck itself onto the planchette. The flag was originally in the rear mini lab, now it's in the forward one. Notice that a mirror has been set up so you can get a side view of activity that's occurring between the two mini labs, so that everything's caught the front, the back, and from the side. Notice the planchette with the rings looped onto it has moved from left to right. Now this is a close-up of what has occurred inside the plastic box in front of the mini lab. You see the planchette clearly. A couple of coins have stuck themselves onto the upper surface. Now in the rear mini lab you can see a card moving from one side to the other slightly. This is in the rear mini lab. Of the matchbox inside the forward mini lab. You can see it moving slightly right at the bottom of the screen. Moves back and forth and off the screen at this point. The large black sphere was a handball into which a small target object ported during the experiments. Cox later found the handball inside a bottle. Now here came a ring outside of the mini lab, apparently ported through the glass. This is panning to show what has happened with the ring, which was inside the mini lab, now outside of it. You can see very little is happening at this point because it's simply panning. Cox has removed the top from the mini lab. Now you notice the rings are lying in front of the mini lab. They originally were hanging on a switch inside the mini lab. Get a much clearer view in this picture because the plastic box has been removed. You don't have to view through it in order to see something happening in the rear mini lab. Here it comes. It's moving independently. This would be during the winter of 1980. You can see that not much is happening at this point. Now you can see that the train has moved, the engine has just been knocked off, the clothespin has moved, and you're going to see another slight jump or movement in a few moments. You can see where the small engine to the train has landed just in front of the mini lab. It's fallen off the edge onto the red table at the very front. Panning to show what has happened. That's the setup. We got movement of clothespin and the engine of the train. Now in this sequence, you notice in the background there's a coffee box. Coffee has been spread over the bottom of a box with a white background, and a cube is on a micro switch. Two frames a second. Notice movement of rings through the glass front of the mini lab. Notice that the rings are going to link now. Watch the rings carefully. You can see this in slow motion. A small film packet has also exited. It later, its dental x-ray film showed a curved radiation mark where the linking rings had been lying on top of it. Now you notice that the rings unlink. One goes back inside the mini lab, leans on the front glass. Now you notice there's going to be some more ring movement. You can watch the rings carefully. Notice this took place at 12:21 or 12:20. I can't quite see that figure on the clock. Midnight. Now you notice that a small medicine valve is dropping off of a micro switch at the front of the mini lab. Then you notice there's more activity. There comes a pin, and you can see that one of the rings is going to move again before long. Going to end with both the rings linked and erect, and then unlinked and erect. There goes the pin, moving very rapidly. Rings are now linked again, and now they're going to unlink, standing upright, one inside the mini lab and one outside the mini lab. Please go to normal speed now. Cox has now put a heavy aluminum bar in the mini lab. You're going to get to see what's happened inside it in a few moments. This is simply panning. You see that the cube is moved. Often these things would happen between experiments so that they were not actually filmed. There is a bar that has been bent inside the sealed locked mini-lab. Cox is explaining what happened in placing objects. This shows a different mini-lab. He's setting a pen up. It will write the words "Glorious 4th" very rapidly. This happened on the 4th of July, still in 1980. The typewriter with the strings in front to show any movement has been set up in front of the mini-lab to see if a letter could be paranormally typed on film. This was not a successful experiment. However, another letter was typed eventually to Julian Isaacs, an English parapsychologist, a parody of the song Aquarius, going, "This is the dinning of the ancient aquariums." Now you can see a letter that is going rapidly off of the typewriter. It mails itself and is gone. The letter later was received by the person to whom it was addressed. Very little will occur here. Simply the letter mailing itself was about the end of that particular segment of the experiment. Again, note that the machine runs. A pen is writing in the background. You can see its tip vibrating. It's addressing a birthday card to a young lady, Steve Calvin's girlfriend. Right, this is reel 16. It shows an aluminum bar coming rapidly through the glass of the mini-lab. Now, go to 2. You can see a letter gradually toppling back and forth and finally exiting. The aluminum bar got enclosed in the letter, incidentally. From the 2 stamps, you can see it was an overseas letter. Went to Dr. John Beloff in Edinburgh, Scotland. It's balanced, right now the letter is balanced on top of the clock. You can go to normal speed now. There went a ring into the letter, rapidly vanished. Pen moved from outside the mini-lab into the mini-lab, right along the base. Cox demonstrates one of the Mara Crandon, Marjorie the Medium rings that were used in Boston back in the 19-teens and 20s. Now, in this sequence, notice there are letters in front of the mini-lab waiting to be answered. You notice the writing, however, is taking place by a pen, which you can see near the center on the right. This is inside the mini-lab. You can see the pen move as it writes on the area between the coffee box and the front of the mini-lab. see the rope has begun to move. This is outside the mini lab, however, but Cox had requested them to try the Indian rope trick, see if they could levitate a rope on camera. And quite obviously it is swinging back and forth immediately in front of the camera. You can see a knot in a moment and then see the end of the rope. Much too close to the lens to prove anything, of course. And there went the tip of the rope. See, there's almost a perverse effect here. It didn't really prove anything, but there goes a ring into the mini lab, and there goes the planchette moving from left to right. So the rope was not the only thing that was happening. This is panning reel number 18. That's William Edward Cox in the background, pointing to what has happened in his mini lab. It's Cox sealing the lock. You can notice the notary seals right over the lock and the string, and in this case, in the cubeless coffee box, the word SORRAT was printed even with no cube there. He places a paper cutout so you can clearly see what was written. That's Steve Calvin, Cox's assistant, working with the mini lab. That's Cox demonstrating what has happened. Thermometer is at the back of the mini lab. Cox and Calvin showing the Cox-Calvin device. Scissors were used by the entities to clip out a small shamrock out of green paper as a task that they set up to see if they could perform it. Pictures of some of the material that happened outside the mini lab setup. Cox is now opening the mini lab, showing how the material was arranged, the letters on micro switches, and now he's putting the top back on, replacing the lock. Showing how it works. As you can see that ESP cards are being used as a target object on a small shelf inside the mini lab, small plastic shelf. See if the entities would assort them according to whether it's circle, plus, star, square, or wavy lines. Now you can see the planchette move in front of the mini lab, pushing the rings out of the way. One of the Marjorie rings is leaning against the glass on the inside of the mini lab, instead of remaining on its micro switch toward the rear. There goes one of the rings, rapidly moving to the right. Planchette moves to the right. and runs off of the shelf in front of the mini lab. The ring continues to move slightly. Jumps back upward. All right, number 20. Here you can see cards assorting themselves. Please go to 2 frames. ESP cards assorting themselves from a stack on a micro switch. When a certain number of cards have assorted themselves, it tripped the lights and camera for the decrease in the weight on the micro switch. Here comes a square moving down to the pile of squares. All right, this, see the next cards assorting themselves. There's one of them flying through the air and landing. You see them take off. There goes one across, lands. Now they erect themselves rapidly and then rapidly vanish back into the mini lab. Normal speed, please. Cogs will then show how they're assorted inside the box. You can see that the stacks have assorted themselves inside the mini lab. 3 of them, 3 on the shelf, 1 over on the top of the coffee box, and 1 even inside the coffee box. Notice the squares are down inside the coffee box. Right, here's panning to show what has happened. Plaster pancake at the green blotch on the piece of paper was marked upon paranormally during the experiment. The thermometer has shown that there was extreme heat briefly. It's a small recording thermometer at the rear of the mini lab. The temperature has increased during the experiment. Now you can see a cube move rapidly through the coffee. See it move back and forth through the coffee grounds in the coffee box. Now one of the Crandon rings falls over and one of the cards flips. Now, notice in this sequence, see, here comes another cube movement through the coffee. Sometimes these were very elaborate. 21, you notice in the background, the cube has moved through the coffee, creating a separate trail. So it had moved, jumped, and moved. There it goes back again. Very rapid cube movement this time. Now one of the rings is flipped up in front of the mini lab. Small packet has dropped. Now comes some more card assortment. Things occur very quickly sometimes. Now a small balloon inside the mini lab has inflated and finally triggered its micro switch. You will notice it moves slightly. Jerk first and then move rapidly back and forth. Notice the temperature has increased again, as you notice from the thermometer. Later on, in one of the very last of the experiments, the thermometer melted. Notice the balloon does move inside the sealed and locked mini lab. It's moved to the left. You also notice that the paper in the rear moved. Cox exhibits a balloon that partially inflated, although it didn't trigger a micro switch. A small card on which a message was written by a pen. It's also shown it was standing in the rear of the mini lab. Now, should be some activity fairly soon in here. Now, yes, you get some paper movement. It's flipping back and forth. Paper was, of course, intended for the pen to write on, as you've noticed in the past. This is 22. You just noticed that one of the boxes went through the glass and into the mini lab. Now you can see a small packet of crayons standing on end and writing a message to Marion Nestor, a letter to Marion Nestor in New York. Here you can see the interior of the mini lab, and here is a balloon inflating inside the mini lab. You can see how it's pressed against the glass. It went off of its micro switch and is now gradually inflating. Notice it has almost a respiration effect. Even though this is tightly sealed, the neck of the balloon was tied with a piece of string very tightly, and yet the air is apparently entering almost as though someone is breathing into the balloon itself. You can see it blowing up. It's going to burst eventually. It gets a little tighter, it'll burst, and then a piece will continue to move. Now, it's going to burst. Now watch at the bottom of the mini lab. You can see the piece continue moving even after the balloon has burst. Here's another balloon that has inflated in the mini lab. In the background you can see a pinwheel. Unfortunately, it's stuck on the coffee box so that it cannot rotate as it was supposed to do. Alright, this is number 23. Cox is showing a chain in a bottle. He's showing how an object's loaded into the mini lab. Going to be some activity before long. Note the small squares of white paper on the edges of the mini lab to show where the glass starts, so it's easy to tell when an object's inside and outside. Now a balloon has inflated and it's moving back and forth, bouncing about inside the mini lab. You can tell it's inside by the positioning of those small squares. It's hitting against the front glass, so it's trying to get out. Those things that look like white eyes on the balloon are really reflections of the two lights that are illuminating the interior of the mini-lab. Just two ordinary gooseneck lamps that are just out of view of the camera. Balloon sitting on top of the coffee tray inside the mini lab and bouncing back and forth. You can see in the shadow in the background the revolution of the pinwheel. Scissors have cut out a small shamrock out of paper and mailed it in a letter to Marion Nestor. Panning shows what has happened. The sealed packet is a packet of ESP cards sealed by George Hansen. Here's more balloon movement, and then you'll notice that the pinwheel revolves independent of the balloon. In fact, it's pushing the balloon to the front, the balloon moves, and then the pinwheel, you'll notice, also moves erratically in the background. Another balloon has partially inflated on a micro switch. Now you'll notice the pinwheel turning and the balloon remaining relatively still. And you'll notice the balloon move. Pinwheel's apparently hitting against the paper. As far as we can tell, the paper isn't moving independently. The pinwheel is causing it to move back and forth as it strikes the edge. This is reel number 24. You can see the mini lab as it was set up. There comes a small target object. There comes another one through the glass. You're going to get a letter vanishing. The letter went to someone in another country. We just lost our film. Now you notice here is a pin moving. Here's a pin moving. Cox tried to get the entities to tell us the identities of some postal robbers. So he put a reward notice that was being circulated up, and we got some information about them, that they were cousins, that they drove a rusty blue Chevrolet truck, and not enough to actually get a reward. Here is a balloon, and I wish that you would rewind this, please, very slowly. Go to 2 frames a second. Reverse. You will see the string tie itself very rapidly in the first couple of frames of this sequence. Just at the start of the sequence, the balloon is on the micro switch, the neck is uppermost, and you can get to see the string tie itself. Please rewind.
Can you rewind faster?
Well, you want to go forward? I'm on rewind.
Rewind faster. Can it go faster?
Okay. Now, forward, please. Very slowly. Make sure that you observe this next sequence in which a string rapidly ties itself around the neck of a balloon at the very beginning, and the balloon inflates neck up from its micro switch. Observe the balloon limp. Now, watch carefully. If you see the string move very rapidly around the neck tie itself. The knot, unfortunately, is in the back of the balloon. There. So the string whip around. Now you can go to normal speed. See the balloon inflating, deflating, inflating, deflating slightly. We found the balloon exactly in this position afterward, and it was absolutely unscathed. No holes, no punctures of any sort. Notice a fire occurring at the same time that a pen is writing a message to be careful with flame. In this sequence, small plastic pendula move slightly. Notice the plastic pendula hanging on the top of the mini lamp. These were simply small pieces of packing plastic that were tied to small pieces of string. Show any movement of anything inside the mini lab. Notice that there is a round package. It's addressed to Marion Nestor in New York. It's sitting inside on the left side of the mini lab. One of the later sequences that will roll about and then vanish. Now you notice those plastic pendula, they are moving disparately. Not all moving in the same direction at once. The balloon moves and the plastic pendula, or at least some of them, beat on it. In more than one direction at once. Whatever the force is that's controlling it, it does seem to be able to move each one of the small pieces of plastic independently. The dandelion in the lower right. Number 25. Notice the pen is up and writing. It is off of its micro switch and it has erected and is writing inside the mini lab. Writing on the strip of paper between the coffee box, the upright envelope, and the mini lab, which doesn't give it very much room to write. In fact, there's a very long, narrow scribble line. The message in this case wasn't significant. Here you can see some movement of the card inside the mini lab. Bent forward and then flipped back. Pendula moving very rapidly in more than one direction. See a balloon inflating and pushing the cards out of the way. Balloon's inflated off of a micro switch in the lower right corner. Cox showing the message and its answer, and also showing one of the dental packets film. Now, notice that this moves to the right and then mails itself very rapidly off Marion Nestor. I believe we've gone to a slower speed now. Continuing to move. More movement of the pendula inside the mini lab. One seems to almost be circling another. notice a shoestring almost doing the Indian rope trick. We're trying the experiment with the mailing of the packet again. The experiment was set up by a Canadian parapsychologist to see if the objects inside the sealed canister would be affected when they went to Mrs. Nestor. Now, notice it goes rapidly into the envelope. And that was received by Dr. James McLennan, who is author of the Entity Papers, Letters from the Mini-Lab. This coin tray, which is shot after the event by William Edward Cox, the coins have assorted themselves by date as required by Cox into small holders that are set in a red coin box. This is a panning of the effects after they'd already happened. This is the locksmith who professionally locked the mini-lab. He had to disassemble his lock after he'd thoroughly jammed it with super glue so that no one could unlock it. And the effects took place anyway. Bending of a spoon, assortment of the coins and other things had taken place. And that's the remnants of the lock. William Edward Cox exhibits this on the trunk of his car to show exactly what had happened left to right. As a balloon is inflated off of its micro switch to the right. Cox is putting something down. There's the coin box. The coins assorted themselves inside the coin box very rapidly. The balloon is also very slightly inflated. New model of the mini-lab being used, as you'll notice, there's a front strap as well as side straps and double locks. You can see a coin rapidly flip out of the mini-lab, and there you see it lands next to another coin just in front of the mini-lab, at the very bottom of the screen. Number 27, late fall 1981. Notice the pen is moving, but it's moving sideways against the clipboard. Now it's fallen. The clipboard itself vibrates. Cox is setting up the equipment. The blown egg, into which a key later apported, has wedged itself on the knight's battle axe through the small hole in the end of the egg. And as the knight and the egg are moving toward the right. Now watch carefully what will happen. The knight is moving toward the right. The cords which were dangling from the top of the mini-lab have wrapped themselves around the knight. And now at this point, watch those rings carefully. Please go to 2 rings a second. The paper rings are sitting on top of the clock. As the knight moves further to the right, you're going to see them link Then they'll erect themselves against the mini lab, and then, apparently due to friction, they will ignite at the point where they linked. So you can go to the linkage, please. Now watch the rings carefully. They're cut from a unusual magazine so that they couldn't be duplicated. Alex has placed them on top of the clock. Watch them link. They're going to link very rapidly. Now they are linked. The rings are linked. The knife continues to move in the background. Now watch the point of linkage. See it darken slightly, char slightly, and finally burst into flame. It's darkening. Little smoke is starting to arise. And now it is catching fire. You can go to normal speed now, please. Is a message which was written in the mini lab. It's "Hi Nancy," signed by Jay. A visitor was coming, although the message was appropriate inside the mini lab. You can see a box now moving toward the left, then it will move quickly back toward the right, and then move toward the left again. The box contained a small atomizer. It's going to move toward the right. Now a pin is moving on paper, but it is not erect and it's not writing. It's simply scooting about. Now go to 2 frames a second, please. These plastic rings have come out of the mini lab. The glass is unbroken, as you can see, and the 2 rings are now linked. The X of string shows where the glass front of the mini lab is. You'll see a second ring, a leather one, come out and join the other 2. Small dental packet tips over, pin falls, vanishes. Pin erects itself, vanishes. The rings has fallen now. It will rapidly join itself onto the 2 rings that are already linked, making 3 linked rings. Leather and 2 plastic. Pin balances the front of the mini lab. The rings have separated and vanished. Actually, they fell onto the floor in front of the mini lab, out of range of the camera. We found them there later. The pen moves one more time very slightly, but you can go to normal speed now, please. You'll notice a timer is moving. Timer started when the mini lab began. Shows 1 revolution a second. Clipboard is moving 2 the right, the back of the mini lab. All right, number 28, Cox is putting a sealed bottle containing a safety pin and 2 straight pipe stem cleaners and a pencil stub and a piece of paper. He's showing the egg into which the key, which was larger than the hole in the egg, had ported. He's exhibiting that in front of the camera. Now, the object falls in front of the mini lab and the letter rapidly leaves. Cox is showing what has happened. Here a balloon has inflated. Knocking the knight to one side, if you notice. You notice the coin tray. Coins have assorted themselves. Seems to be an intelligence involved to get the coins into the correct holders and write coherent messages, so forth. It does not seem to be random energy movement. Letters have fallen from the top of the mini lab to the front of it. Panning to show where the letters fell. Landed. Cox is showing how a lock became entangled with 2 leather rings, unhooked itself from the mini lab and swung violently through the top of the mini lab. We'll show in a moment exactly what did happen. Here's Ariel on top of the clock on the clipboard in front of the mini lab. The pencil has fallen. Nothing's happening there at present. Shows the message, shows the coins. Shows how the clipboard is arranged for micro switch, and shows how the box smashed through a hole through the top of the mini lab. Nothing's happening at this point. Cox is showing clipboard, the message, and what has occurred. Right, number 29. Number 29. Reel 29. You see that there's a cone for revolution, a letter in front of the coffee box. Cox is showing what is happening with the Now what's happening here, the ESP cards are sorting themselves from a sealed container provided by the FR&M in Durham. Sealed container. See, one of them's coming out now. And you'll see them assort themselves rapidly and re-enter the box without breaking the seal. We're starting to assort right now. One. They're correctly assorted and the seal is not broken. Go to normal speed, please. The balloon appears, falls in front of the mini lab. Continues to move slightly. Now watch this disappear. Went to Marion Nestor in New York. Pin's moving. Unfortunately, it has a large blob of solder wire stuck on its tip, so you don't get much message. Pin continues to move slightly. The balloon moves inside the mini lab, moving from left to right, rolling along on top of the coffee box and then moving upward slightly. No, it's probably... Okay. Now let her rapidly move off a micro switch and mailed itself, moving to the right. Now you can see that the parasol has hooked itself onto the Knight's battle axe, and the parasol and Cox's brown sealed bottle are both moving from left toward right inside the mini lab. Front are messages, letters, a pen, and other objects waiting to be affected. December 1981, this is Reel 30. Here is Steve Calvin, Cox's assistant, and this is the McDonald Laboratory for Psychical Research, or MacLab, mini lab. It's been set up in the isolation room to supplant Ed Cox's earlier mini lab, the Cox-Calvin device. This is a similar principle except much more elaborate. Balance scales, console, LEDs to show a variety of things. It has audio as well as film capacity, mirror to show everything in the room, shows barometric pressure changes, temperature changes, and a vast number of other things. They're small micro switches with objects on top. These things can control time and other readings. This is from Washington University in St. Louis. Dr. Peter Phillips was given a grant by McDonald, the McDonnell Douglas Aircraft Corporation, to try to discover what made psychokinesis work, which would be a vast advantage to McDonnell Douglas if they could be the first people to patent this. So he kept a running log. That's on December 10th. A variety of small objects, a small Christmas tree on micro switch 2, Santa Claus on 3, a Rubik's Cube on 2, letters to be mailed. That picks up any sound, radiation, a mirror to each side, There shows a side view of what's happening simultaneously to a front view, and instructions to the entities to cooperate if they will. This test resulted in the MacLab film, which dealt with the 7 best events. Their camera was enclosed in a box which was locked by Peter Phillips. The only thing that could be done to it was to wind it, and he had to change the film. Very carefully locked and sealed, but the same general principle as Cox's earlier Cox-Calvin device. Here you can see the MacLab, the McDonald Laboratory for Psychical Research mini lab. Thank you very much for watching this film, and I hope that you have come to understand what the SORRAT experiments with the Cox Mini-Lab equipment really were. In conclusion, I would like to show the dissolving effect by putting segments which you have already seen into slow motion. You will see that one ring appears to become transparent so that you can see the other ring under it. You can see that cards appear to become slightly transparent before they vanish. You notice a strange bilocation effect. The rings at the bottom are still partly visible when they begin to grow and materialize leaning against the Mini-Lab glass. We feel that this research is very important and should be replicated by many other experimenters elsewhere. Thank you.